So for those of you that aren't familiar, Commute Seattle is a nonprofit transportation management association. We serve as sort of this central hub of information for our partners, such as King County Metro, Sound Transit, Seattle Department of Transportation, and more. We're here to help commuters choose smart, sustainable mobility choices, and also help you promote climate-friendly travel options and implement innovative solutions at your building. We can help you leverage your location to get commuters to your building without stress. A little harder these days, but we'll get to that. Helping you figure out orca passes, stay in compliance with local laws, and monitor your TMP programs and more. Back to you, Sarah. I feel like a news reporter. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Awesome. So today we'll be tackling the question, what can you do with your empty parking spaces? We'll be starting off with a presentation from Ben Rosenblatt, a senior planner at SDOT, about measuring transportation emissions in Seattle. And then Brian Hamlin, who's the curb space management strategic advisor at SDOT, will give us some key takeaways from the 2021 Center City off-street parking study. And after that, we'll break into some discussion. So I hope you stick around for that. But passing it off to Ben.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate Commute Seattle making the space for what should be an interesting conversation around parking. I just wanted to provide a very quick 5 to 10 minute background on kind of where SDOT is with our analysis of the climate emergency and kind of how that will feed into the discussion today. So next slide, Sarah. So first, just want to talk about our goals. Next slide, please, on emissions reduction. So a few years back, we adopted a climate action plan, which calls for a transportation emissions reduction of 82% from 2008 levels by 2030. And just last year, under the Durkin administration, we adopted a Green New Deal, which has an aspirational goal to be climate pollution free by 2030. So we have some big goals out there. Next slide. We also adopted a document last year called the Transportation Electrification Blueprint, which hopefully many of you are familiar with. And within that document, obviously it's about electrification, but we have a couple of more specific goals on our trip making. I've highlighted the two of them that are pretty relevant to folks in the parking space, in the off-street parking world. One is that 9 out of every 10 trips, personal trips, should be zero emission by 2030. So that can mean an electric vehicle. It can also mean walking, biking, or emissions-free transit. And we also have a 30% goods delivery goal. So it's not quite as aggressive, recognizing the challenges of electrifying goods delivery, but still a significant portion compared to today. Next slide. So now I will talk about how hard it's going to be to meet those goals. So transportation is the biggest source of emissions here in Seattle. About 60% or so of emissions come from our transportation system. Next slide. So given that, we have a lot of work to do to begin with, knowing that transportation is the biggest source of emissions. I mentioned that 9 out of 10 goal before. As of 2019, so this is pre-COVID, which is a good, I think, baseline kind of understanding of our travel patterns. On the personal trip side, as opposed to 9 out of 10 being emissions free, only about 3.5 out of 10 were emissions free. The other 65% were in ICE vehicles or internal combustion engine, i.e. fossil fuel vehicles. So if you think about in the future, only 8 years from now, the average Seattleite, if they leave their house 10 times over the course of a week, and today they take a car 6.5 times, in the future, it could only be on average overall 1 time in a fossil fuel vehicle. So that's a significant amount of trips that need to be shifted over out of ICE vehicles. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, we have an 82% transportation emissions goal reduction. If anyone wants to put some guesses in the chat as to how far along we are, I'm curious if anyone can guess the right number in terms of how much our emissions have changed. Maybe someone will venture a guess and be close. Anybody? Any number? 85. Julian, does that mean an 85? Does that mean we've gone up? Is that what you're implying? Which is possible. All right. Well, anyway, Sarah, you can click on. We've only made the progress we've made so far is 3%. So we need to reduce by 82. over essentially, since '08 through 2030. So, we need to go down 82, and in about 10 years, we've gone down about 3. So in the next decade or so, we have the remaining 79. So it just goes to show you we have a big hill to climb. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to go through a little bit about SDOT's approach in terms of meeting this really, really, really big challenge. So we're looking at emissions reduction really through 2 lenses. Efficiency, which is on the left side. That's really, I think to this audience, think about mode shift really. So reducing the amount of miles that we travel by getting folks to take transit, walking, or biking. And, we do that through expansion of transit service and transit priority. We do investments to make walking and biking safer and more attractive. I personally, in my day-to-day, work on TDM programming with many TMP and CTR clients, and there are other strategies as well on that side that we're thinking about, including our land use connection and potential funding mechanisms to fund some of these improvements. On the other side, we have decarbonization, which essentially on the transportation space just means electrification of pretty much everything that moves people, goods, and services. And we've done some analysis, and we can really only get to those very aspirational goals if we focus on both of these things equally. And I think the interesting part about thinking about, the topic today of parking spaces and what to do with those parking spaces that are being underutilized is that we can look at it through both of these lenses. Next slide. We're also looking at our climate problem through an equity lens, and we're about to release what we're calling the Transportation Equity Framework and an associated implementation plan. So this is just a sneak preview of what should, I think, be public in a month or two. You'll see all these circles around here. A lot of them are related to climate. For example, transit access and providing more mobility and transportation options. All of these are related to climate. Climate is not called out specifically, but that's because climate and solving for the climate problem and pursuing climate justice all undercuts kind of everything around transportation equity. So making the link between our equity work and our nascent climate work is going to be really, really important going forward. Next slide. So what we've done for the last year or so is we've created an internal tool that we're calling the Climate Calculator, which gives us a model. It's basic, but it is a model that shows how the different things that we do or could do, how they impact vehicle miles traveled and the resulting emissions. And with this tool, we're able to look at different combinations of strategies to see what kinds of investment packages might we need to achieve that necessary reduction in greenhouse gases. And right now, what we're working on is continuing to improve those data inputs into this tool and improve the user friendliness. So we're going to be rolling it out in the next couple of months, first for internal use within SDOT, but I would expect that at some point in the next year or so, getting this out publicly so that we can really have this conversation more directly with the public about the different combinations of things that we need to do. And as that last bullet describes, thinking about the strategies that we need to do to actually meet the challenge that's ahead of us. Next slide. A sneak peek of what the calculator is saying is that a whole lot is not surprisingly needs to happen. So just starting at the upper left there, we're seeing that in order to meet our goals, we would need at least twice as many transit trips as today. And we've had a great amount of transit growth in the city and the region to begin with over the last decade or so. So that's going to be a big hill to climb, and it'll include a significant increase in transit service. By 2030, we would need to have at least half the cars on the road being electric compared to it's maybe 2 or 3% today. So that's a significant amount of EV uptake. We'll need commuters who currently drive to think about doing other modes and or working from home more often. And that's with kind of all the progress that we've made and continue to make through our CTR and TMP programs. And I think this is of particular interest probably to today's audience. We're also thinking about that, there's pretty much no way to meet our climate goals without pricing the use of the roadway for driving in some kind of way. That way is still to be determined and is under study. And then finally, probably maybe the most realistic of these is to double the number of trips made by bike. I think we're already seeing a pretty significant amount of bike usage growth due to the pandemic. And we'll keep working on the bike network to make that more of an option for folks. Next slide. Just another way to look at it. This is, if we are to meet our goals or to almost meet our goals, we're talking about a lot of trips that happen on a daily basis that would need to shift away from internal combustion engine vehicles to something else on the order of 2 million trips a day. So those trips can be shifted to all sorts of things. It could be walking, biking, transit, or remote work. And for trips that still must be made by car, we need those trips shifted to EV, to electric vehicle. Next slide. And just to conclude on a pretty depressing note in this Earth Week, but I think it's important to be a little bit depressing and yet optimistic at the same time, is that we are not even on pace to even remotely come close to meeting our climate goals in the transportation space right now, not even close. So we need all the help we can get from both internal partners and private sector actors and willing pilot project participants. All of the above is going to be necessary to close this gap and to meet the urgency of the moment. So with that, I think that's it, Sarah. Oh, and yeah, we will, today what we're going to do is, with all that in mind, that giant challenge in mind, let's think about the off-street parking supply together, and let's think about what we can do. So Brian from my team from SDOT is going to talk in some good detail about what we're seeing in terms of off-street parking conditions today in Center City, and then we'll have a discussion where hopefully we'll have some creative ideas. I'll pass it off to Brian now.
Great, thanks Ben, and thanks Sarah for hosting this, and everybody with Commute Seattle. Yeah, so I thought this would be a really good opportunity to talk about the our latest 2021 off-street parking study survey that we do biannually. There's some really interesting findings this year, collecting it during the middle of a pandemic, which should spark some interesting conversations towards the end of this. But what we're going to talk through, I'm going to do a quick, background on the study and how we conduct this study, and then we'll walk through some of the kind of high-level key findings from the latest survey, which I think will be pretty interesting for folks on the call here. And then at the end of it, we'll leave a little bit of space for discussion. And it'll take me about, I think, maybe like 12 or 13 minutes. Okay, background. Go to the next slide. So the purpose of our study, why do we do this? That's, it's evolved over time, but really the core of it is that we want to be able to, SDOT rather, we want to be able to monitor our off-street parking supply over time. You can see on the last bullet here that the study that we did this previous year is something that we've been building on. We do this study, the survey rather, biannually, starting in 2014, and it existed in different shapes and forms previous to that, but the modern study we've been doing since 2014, and you can find all the previous reports on our website if you're interested in looking. And what we use it for is we want to understand what public parking occupancy and the supply looks like throughout downtown Seattle, and what that looks like per neighborhood, because we use this information to set our on-street parking rates, to make decisions for mobility upgrades or modal plan upgrades on the street. Like, it's very valuable information to us. And what it does is it allows us to, we can see, because we do this longitudinal study over time, is we can see these changes and these trends that happen, right? So, the last one we did in 2021, the middle of the pandemic, it gives us a good opportunity to see this benchmark of what did work from home policies look like? What did, when businesses all really pivoted to delivery services, or businesses that kind of went out and that no longer were providing their normal service that they once were. It really offered us a good opportunity to get that snapshot of what it looks like in Seattle during this time period. You can go to the next one. So how do we conduct this study? So what it is, you can see on the map here on the right-hand side, is we survey every single publicly available off-street parking facility. It's a huge undertaking. I think Marnie Heffron from Heffron Transportation is on the call, and they were the ones that went out and collected all this information, which is a huge task. So absolutely shout out to them, props to them for getting us this information. And we were able to identify that there's over 250 facilities that are out there. And we had collected the data from April to June in 2021. This information is collected on we do weekday collections, and that's in the AM and the PM period. And then we also do a smaller sample on weekends and Friday evenings as well, to try to get an understanding of what the parking situation is for, once work is out and folks are visiting restaurants or bars at night, things like that. And the information that we collect, you can see it on the list here, but we look at the parking supply, occupancy, hours of operation, just really getting the different types of parking spaces that are out there, just trying to get a really comprehensive snapshot of all the different activities that could potentially be happening at these off-street sites. You can go next one. All right, and now I'm going to talk through some of the results that we found from this last study. So looking at the supply, like I mentioned previously, there's over 250 off-street garages and lots, which is actually, so that it was about 60,000 spaces, which is quite a bit, when you actually see it and see that number in the flesh. And it's actually 16 facilities less than there were in 2018. I mean, all you have to do is go walk or take a cruise downtown. You can see all the different development that's happening. There's new garages that are coming online, which I'll actually talk about in a second, and then existing parking lots that are being redeveloped. So there's a lot of change that's happening. So that's another reason why this study that we do is really important to understand what that supply looks like. Looking at the facilities, or the neighborhoods rather, that had the greatest number of new facilities, or rather greatest number of facilities, the retail core and South Lake Union South, which I don't have a mouse to click on, but just imagine you're viewing it on the map there. They had the highest amount with 34 facilities, and then the commercial core retail area had the greatest number of spaces with over 12,000. So again, lots and lots of spaces there. And then you can go to the next slide. Some additional fun facts here on the supply. The neighborhood that had the greatest increase in supply since 2018 was Denny Triangle North. And these areas line up with our paid parking areas. So if any of you all are familiar with how SDOT kind of subdivides the city in our paid parking areas or zones, that's what we're referring to here. So there was actually a 65% increase in Denny Triangle North, which is 2,800 spaces. I mean, that's a lot. This is all those new buildings coming online since the previous study. So, quite a bit. And then the greatest decrease that we saw was Denny Triangle South and Belltown South, which is a 19 and 17% decrease respectively. So over 1,000 spaces lost in those neighborhoods. And then, the last bullet, really only saw 4 areas that actually had an increase in off-street parking supply since 2018. You can go to the next one. So now looking at the occupancy, which I think this is some of the most interesting information, and probably not too surprising if anyone's been paying attention to the news over the last couple of years here. But the numbers were kind of low. Looking at the morning occupancy, so the highest area that we had surveyed was the commercial core waterfront area at 44%. Comparing that to 2018, it was actually 57% occupied when we collected the data. And then the lowest is the stadium neighborhood, right? In the morning, kind of lines up still, 12%, it's extremely low. And then the overall average for morning occupancy was only 27%. So quite low. And then looking at the afternoon occupancy numbers, the highest neighborhood we had was the Chinatown International District core area. We break Chinatown into 2 separate areas, but the core area had the highest occupancy, which was actually a slightly over the 2018 occupancy numbers. So, that neighborhood has been, historically, you go down there, it's quite challenging to park, and it lines up with the data that we collected. And then the lowest, which was actually very surprising here, is Belltown North. It was only 13% occupied compared to 2018, which was nearly 70%. So quite a big drop there. And again, on average, only 28% occupied. You can go to the next one. And then for our evening and weekend samples, right, that I mentioned before, we do sample counts in some of the specific areas. Again, the commercial core waterfront neighborhood, 70%. I know there's been changes down there with construction and different buildings coming on and offline. So I think that's possibly some of the variability that we're seeing there. But when you actually take a step back and look at the data, the waterfront area had quite high occupancy throughout the entire study, like all the different garages. And that's because, you know, folks were like, the tourism sector was still like pretty good down there, like folks during the summertime. And then when we did this study in the early spring, we're still going down there to, you know, patronize the businesses and do their thing down at the waterfront. And not surprisingly, the lowest was the financial district at only 15% occupied. So pretty big drop there. And then same again, occupancy for the weekend, commercial core waterfront as 63%. So occupancy was kind of what we figured that would be, but all the other neighborhoods were extremely low. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, this is a great slide. I wish I could zoom in a little bit if I could. I see Sarah scrunching her eyes, so maybe we can't do that now. Totally okay. I can share these slides after, but the chart here on the left, you can see the change in parking occupancy for the different like specific areas. So you can see the morning and afternoon, and then the color coding on the left, you can see blue is 2014, and then the right is 2021. So this is comparing all our different surveys to each other. And you can see, you know, occupancy was never, even in 2014, 2016, 2018, it was never close to 100%. If anything, you know, maybe we crack 80%, usually hovers around 70. But looking at 2021, you know, we're below 30% for all these neighborhoods. So tremendous amount of open space in these garages and in these parking lots. So you can go to the next slide. And then as we kind of get towards the end of this here, looking at the parking rates, interestingly enough. So as I just mentioned, the commercial core, really the financial area, very, very low occupancy, but still had the highest average parking rates that you have to pay. Really 2 hour, 4 hour, 24 hours, well, you know, $15 to $25 accordingly, depending on which one you pick here. And then the lowest average parking rates we had identified in Little Saigon and Uptown West area as well. So those rates were quite low. But interestingly, and I'll key on this one at the end here, but as we look over time, the rates really haven't changed much since we've been collecting data. They've gone up a little bit, maybe a tiny bit of a drop for 2021, but have remained very stable and have not swung as much comparatively to what we've seen in the market and really what the demand might outline. And so this this chart here is kind of highlighting what I was just mentioning. If we look longitudinally over time, you can see really from 2016 to 2021, a little bit of uptick, maybe a little bit of a downslide in parking rates as we went into 2021. But given that the occupancy was so low, it was just surprising to see that there wasn't more of a pricing incentive to get people to use these spaces. It was still pretty expensive to be able to park in those lots. And then with this slide here, so as I mentioned, one of the great things that we do is when we survey all these garages, we collect information on the different typologies and the different space types that are available for in all the different garages. And interestingly, and I kind of love diving into the details here because Heffron, they provide us with this great database of all the different typologies, and we can look at it and do analysis based on the year that we have information on. But the neighborhood with the most amount of electric vehicles, Denny Triangle North, 254, that kind of makes sense. These are all the newer buildings. So these buildings, we're seeing a lot more electric vehicle dedicated spaces there as well, which was quite interesting. And then, car share, we have car share of LA reserved. You can see the numbers here. It's interesting to see the different types of spaces that we have in these neighborhoods. You can go to the next one. So to kind of wrap all this up, the big takeaways here that I want to get across, the biggest one is that the parking occupancy for the weekday in our commercial core, which you can see in the map, is this red dotted line here, was only 34%. So that's really, really low, which kind of makes sense if you think in the pandemic and all the different factors that are in play. But now we have very tangible, hard data that we can compare to previous studies. And ideally, in the next 2 years, we will do this survey again, and we'll be able to compare and see what, if a recovery was in place or how these spaces are utilized differently, right? There's a lot of questions we would like to answer with a future study. So there was a 50% decrease from the previous studies in occupancy. Again, just really sinking home that the occupancy values are very, very low. And this is so these numbers are also heavily buoyed by the waterfront neighborhood. I told you those occupancy numbers were quite high. The rest were all very, very low. So we see them overall, it makes the average, come up a little bit. And then outside the commercial core is really only 24%, which is a third of what we had seen in 2018. So again, very, very low. And then the 2-hour rates just haven't really changed much since 2014, which we all find quite interesting, especially when we're setting our on-street rates. And then, now what? And we can zip through these, but these are just an insight on some of the questions that we're thinking about in SDOT, and I'm sure you all are thinking about these as well on the call. Is when we're setting our on-street rates, they're quite low right now comparatively to the off-street parking rates. So that's something that we're trying to think through and trying to manage. Because we want to provide availability on the curb, but we also want to make sure that we're meeting our climate goals and not incentivizing folks to drive as much. And then looking at all this additional space, we can start to think about, can we engage on EVs, right? Like, as Ben mentioned in his presentation, that there's a huge opportunity and a huge challenge for us to be able to meet our climate goals. With this additional space, we might be able to think creatively about that. In addition, I think we might talk about this in a minute here, we've piloted with the Urban Freight Lab, Seattle DOT has, on their urban freight micro hub pilot that they had in Belltown, which was a really great study to be part of. They thought creatively about their off-street space and how to create, delivery services from that space. But then there's also a lot of challenges in place for reutilizing or repurposing this off-street space, which is both, a challenge and a way to really think creatively about what we can do with the space and how we can all kind of come together to meet all of our goals. So I think that is the last slide here. So any questions? I think we just maybe have 1 or 2 minutes.
Yeah, any questions for either Ben or Brian? You can either just take yourself off mute or write it in the chat. Give it a second. No, that's a lot to process. A lot of great information.
Yeah,
a lot
for
of
sure.
Impactful. Yeah, very impactful.
We're still thinking through it. I mean, we got these results several months ago now, like last fall, and as an agency, it's just trying to understand what are the impacts of this information. How does this impact our future planning? A lot of statistics to think through, and really, it's just a different world out there right now. Going through the pandemic, we're still kind of in it. It's quite challenging for everyone involved.
Yeah, well, all good. If there are no questions, we'll have a little time in a second. But yeah, really just the takeaways from all of this. The data shows that parking occupancy is low right now. Like, that was super clear. But it also showed that in 2014, 2016, and 2018. So we've never been close to 100% occupancy all the time. So today we're really talking about what can be done with, say, 10 or 20% of your space. even if you weren't going to be filling that space anyway, especially as the future of hybrid work evolves. We'll see what the city looks like, but really thinking about this new normal and how you could potentially employ creative uses of parking spaces in order to recoup revenue, possibly provide new services for tenants and residents and things like that. So yeah, Ross is chiming in. This is a pea patch on top of the garage by the Seattle Center. Like, how cool is that? I didn't know that was there until I was doing research into this. So very awesome. So while you mull on this a little, we're going to get the breakout room squared away. But first, we're just going to watch one video about the UW Urban Freight Labs neighborhood delivery hub. I think the video here just explains it way better than words. So.
The last mile of delivery is costly, and we really need to find efficiencies and find ways of doing that in a low impact, low emissions manner.
The city just released a transportation electrification blueprint. Our goal is to get to 30% of
Did it pause for everyone?
goods delivery being zero emissions by 2030.
Delivery by electric assist cargo bike is one of the ways that we will be able to meet those goals, and we are offering an opportunity to test and design those systems here in Seattle.
REEF is trying to provide proximity as a service. That means that we create these micro hubs where we have different partners and to maximize the usage on parking lots and really help out these local areas that are in need of services.
We're actually going out and using this micro hub as one of our pickup stations for drivers with electric cargo bikes to be able to pick up packages and from here go out and deliver them to the customers.
We're a domestic manufacturer of ECTs, electric cargo trikes. We're looking at developing the most sophisticated e-drive system to help carriers not only deliver packages and goods in a more environmental manner, but also in a more cost-effective manner.
We provide our REEF kitchens for residents and guests to be able to order food online so that these delivery platform drivers don't have to drive miles. Obviously, customers can choose the option to pick up their food.
Common carrier lockers are open to all retailers and any user who registers for the system. Neighbors can complete their own last mile by picking up packages.
BrightDrop's involvement in this key micro hub activity that we're doing here in Seattle is to essentially reimagine the future. And we're encouraging people to go to a place of imagination and think about what could be versus what is today.